I'm Becky Quick of CNBC and your host of The Forum. I'll be guiding you through exclusive conversations among some of the world's global leaders. Conversations previously held behind club doors, but today we invite you in. The Economic Club of New York serves as the premier forum for nonpartisan discussion dedicated to connecting the world's brightest minds with preeminent public and private sector leaders. A nonprofit 501c3, the club is a 115-year-old platform for the conversations that help shape the future of our world. The Economic Club of New York, brightest minds, critical conversations, catalyst for innovation.
Your book, Shocks, Crises, and False Alarms, is refreshing in that it emphasizes the importance of not relying too heavily on traditional economic models or simple rules that often promise quick conclusions about the economy or markets. And instead, it provides readers with a guide to understanding and navigating economic risks and coming to their own common sense conclusions. In our conversation today, what I'm hoping is that our audience gets some insight not only into your views today about the markets and the economy, but also leaves with a better understanding and a different framework on how to think about risk management generally. But to kick off our discussion, Philip, maybe if you could share a bit about your background and how your experiences have shaped your views and the approach you take in the book.
I'd be happy to. I've worked in the economic space for close to 2 decades, started out as an economics undergraduate student, eventually going to grad school. But I think the timing of when I first encountered economics as a discipline is important. It was around the turn of the century, being an undergraduate at the London School of Economics at the time. And that was sort of peak economics, if you will, when economics as a discipline was riding high. There was a certain infallibility about the discipline. We can solve a lot of problems. We can, fix economies the way that surgeons and doctors treat a patient. And often that was brought back to models and a lot of mathematics. And as a student at the time, I was certainly exposed to that, but also very skeptical of it. Even then, that didn't feel quite right. Even as it was still about 6, 7, 8 years to the global financial crisis at that time, right? So that was still some time off, an event that kind of dinged the discipline significantly. But even then, it felt a fairly reduced version of the world. So after going through economics, I worked in business, I worked in finance, and through the years, as I became a publishing analyst and author over the years, I continued to look past the boundaries of economics and try to be a little more multidisciplinary, bringing in adjacent views, and always wary of particularly top-down forecasts and the ability or the pretense that we can actually boil this down to single indicators. So there's a bit of a history there in how I've grown up in the discipline and working in economics, all of which comes into the book, which I co-wrote with my co-author, Paul Swartz, who has a similar history of engaging with economics. So it's we think very much alike on that.
When you talk about peak economics, which is a little bit what you grew up with, as you say, at the turn of the century, you're talking about peak dependency on models being able to predict the outcomes.
Absolutely.
And it reminds me of I think it's Andrew Lowe, who said something on the order of in physics you have 3 rules that define 99% of the world, and in economics you have more than 99 rules that define less than 3%. And it seems like that's the approach that you've taken.
So true. It's a great quote.
Having talked about 3 rules, your book talks about 3 interesting principles for navigating economic risks. Number 1, you mentioned not sticking to just one model. Number 2, tuning out the doomsayers. And then 3rd, embracing what you describe as economic eclecticism. Can you share a little bit more about what each of those 3 means and the role that it plays in the way that you look at forecasting?
Yeah, master model mentality is what we call it in the book, and it speaks to this desire to think of economics as a natural science. where you have stable relationships of causes and effect, and where you essentially can reduce things to measurable developments and can also forecast with some precision. What we argue in the book is that this master model mentality is really a fallacy because economics isn't constructed like that. And we're certainly not the first ones to make that point. This goes far back. It goes back to the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises made the point that we shouldn't treat economics as a natural science. Keynes made similar arguments. And Hayek, we quote Hayek repeatedly in the book in the 70s, particularly, he made the case that there is a big danger here of leading to erroneous forecasts and erroneous results. And that certainly we agree with that. And so we say, embrace the uncertainty that economics brings. Don't try to sort of minimize it compulsively. You will never minimize that uncertainty entirely. You can't have the forecasts that work and deliver each and every single time. So you have to start to embrace that uncertainty and look beyond it. The second point, which is about the doomsaying slant of economics as a discipline, is really the observation that the way public discourse is constructed, the way we run this is slanted to the downside. So the business model of financial news is heavily dependent on our clicks and our eyeballs. And so there is a constant stream of coverage and commentary that plays up the risks and is skewed to doomsaying narratives. We can revisit some of those of the last few years if there's interest, but clearly we don't usually get a rational discourse of the distribution of risk and weigh those against each other. We usually jump to the edges of the risk distribution on financial TV, say, and we drag them to the center of the risk distribution, and we pretend that the economy is perpetually, at the cliff edge and just about to fall to its economic death. And then the third habit that we point out, or the third theme of how we can navigate all this better, is what you mentioned, economic eclecticism, which is really just a fancy word for saying multidisciplinarity. Economics is not a great soloist, we write in the book, but it does play well in a band. So if you combine it with adjacent insight from other disciplines, whether that's finance, history, political science, political economy, that will enrich economics and the analysis it can provide, and it will lead to better results if you do so.
Maybe dig in a little bit on each of the three. The first I think of is really to avoid using one model to reach a conclusion. And I think of examples perhaps like the SOM rule or inverted yield curve is two. But is that what you're thinking through?
Yeah, these are great examples. The book takes some of these to task. The yield curve has a checkered history. I mean, it's not just the last 2 years where it sent incorrect signals of recession. Even 2018, 2019, I mean, it was pretty clear that often the recession signal that you can derive from an inverted yield curve is scrambled or polluted or just not very clean and clear. And the SOM rule that you mentioned is just sort of an iteration of that history. I mean, it's just a new chapter in that. By the way it's designed, there's a lot of back testing. It looks good on the surface, but I think Claudia Sohm herself has come out and said, look, I mean, it was triggered and supposedly we're in recession, but she doesn't actually believe that. And that just goes to show you will not be able to capture the complexity, the multidisciplinary complexity in a single number. And if you then take such a number and derive conclusions and actions from it, you're quite likely to be caught out or wrong-footed, and it could be costly to do so.
Yeah, it's another quote that I like is, I think it's Boxer's quote, who said, "All models are wrong and some are useful." And effectively, the some are useful is it plays well in a band.
Couldn't agree more.
In terms of ignoring the doomsayers, what you're describing is one where doomsayers tend to get more press because it's easier to sell. Is that kind of the primary driver of why you think negativity, it tends to be more pervasive, or is it something else?
It's part of it, for sure. I think it'd be unfair to claim the audience doesn't want part of that. I mean, it's thrilling to hear about all these existential risks that are supposedly so
Yeah.
close all the time. So I think it's both supply and demand. But when we think about what plays well on audio, visually, on TV, elsewhere in the podcast sphere, I think there is an interest to tell the really big risks, the stories about the really big risks, and evaluate, how close are we, or how bad is the damage going to be. It's just the way, the way the culture is playing out, our discourse, the way we conduct it. And I don't think this will change. So it's really incumbent upon the audience, executives, investors, to be very cognizant of that. What the book argues is to say, like, you have to develop a habit of looking past the doom mongering. Ask who's speaking, what are their interests, what is the perch they're speaking from, what is their history of making such forecasts. Often you'll see a lot of doomsayers have a grand history of making many doomsday predictions, and occasionally they're right, but is that the broken clock, proverbially, that is right twice a day, or is that genuine insight and forecast? Usually it's the former, not the latter. And so it's really upon us to just be very aware and cognizant of this, and develop some tools and habits to discount some of that doom mongering.
The third one you described, economic eclecticism, and I think you described it as depending on a multivariable analysis or a multi-factor analysis. Maybe the best way to probe there a little bit more is to go back to, I believe it was March of 2020, in the depths of the COVID crisis, where you wrote a bullish article on the economy in Harvard Business Review. I'd like you to describe a little bit what went into that constructive view at the time.
Yeah, March 2020 was shelter in place, and then the lockdowns. And quite predictably, it led to an overshoot on the doomsday narrative side. I think a lot of, obviously, worry and scare was warranted, and it's not like this was certain to be a good and strong and fast recovery. But what was interesting was the habitual willingness to immediately spin this into a worst case scenario. So what was very common at the time, the conventional wisdom, was this will be a very lengthy, slow, and arduous recovery, maybe taking 6 or 7 years. Lots of commentators were even willing to go back in time to the 1930s. So it's not just as bad as 2008. They said the global financial crisis. They even linked it to the Great Depression of the 1930s. And a lot of this stemmed from actually the master model mentality of looking at key indicators, in this case, unemployment, which went to 14% very, very rapidly, of course, because of the lockdowns, and say, well, we've had 10% unemployment in the past, and that took 8-9 years to recover fully after 2008. Say now we have 14%, so it's going to take even longer on the recovery side. And so there was really a confluence of master model thinking, the doomsaying narrative that is so dominant in public discourse, and that gave you predictions of the recovery time that were far off the mark. What was feasible at the time was not to pound the table and say, hey, this is going to be recovered within 18 months or 2 years, but what was feasible was to step back and look at this with a broader lens, not look only at the unemployment rate, but say, well, what does it take to get a really poor recovery, such as after 2008? What are the coherent drivers that give us that kind of outcome? And do we have a coherent narrative today that such drivers will be dominant? And if you did that, you looked not just at the unemployment rate and model-based recovery times based on history. You asked very, very quickly, even in March 2020, what is it that policy can do? What is the amount or quantity of help we need? Is there a need for policy innovation of how we deliver this? Is there feasibility, both the ability and willingness of policymakers to do that? And if you looked at that, as we did in March 2020 in that article you mentioned in HBR, we arrived at the conclusion that this is not a foregone conclusion of doom and a very lengthy recovery. This can actually be pretty tight, and policy can be mobilized to turn this around pretty quickly. And so, yes, I do agree with you. It is an example of all of these things, the master model mentality that set us up into doomsday narratives, and I think the multidisciplinary eclecticism kind of helped to take a calmer take on the situation there.
So you looked at not just what are the drivers that could make it a disaster, but also what are the potential drivers, primarily economic and monetary or fiscal and monetary stimulus, that could turn the narrative the other way. How did you have the confidence that fiscal and monetary stimulus would actually politically be feasible and be enacted?
In the book, we treat the topic of stimulus at some length. There are 3 chapters in total on stimulus, and over the years, Paul and I, we've published on the history of stimulus and 2 different types of stimulus that we see in the broader landscape. The first is existential stimulus, which is when policymakers rescue the economy wholesale, backstop the really bad systemic downside, which is something we've seen a number of times, 2008, 2020, sort of big programs, and they require the willingness and the ability of policymakers to do so. Ability comes down to funding. Our financial markets go into finance, extra debt for this. The willingness is really about politics. Are we coming together to pass legislation to backstop the economy? Well, when the house is on fire, like in 2020 or 2008, actually the willingness falls into place sooner or later. In the book, we go into TARP in the global financial crisis, 700 billion, which seems like a small ticket from today's perspective, but as we remind readers, that was voted down initially, TARP, in Congress, and the market sold off, and it convinced politicians to come together and pass TARP, and it did in the end, and that was a big piece of the recovery then. So that's existential stimulus, and we think that is essentially still in place. We think that is healthy. If we encounter another big crisis, which inevitably at some point we will, we have significant confidence that in the US and many other wealthy economies, that ability to mobilize this existential stimulus is strong. That is separate, however, from what we call tactical stimulus, which is more of a frivolous history of continuously always juicing the cycle, always pushing the economy. We've called it also the compulsive stimulus model in the past. So there was a whole 60-year history in the book that we walk through of how we've gone from initially just debt finance in the 80s, actually under Reagan that really took off, and then later we were tolerating bubbles, which spurred wealth and consumption, and then we tolerated super low interest rates, and there were multiple cycles of just pushing and pushing, either actively or tolerating dynamics that just pushed a lot of stimulus and always kept the economy moving forward through tactical stimulus. And that more tactical side, which is driven by politicians and policymakers, is very different from existential stimulus. That one is constrained now. Why? Because we have a somewhat different inflation environment. The risks are skewed to the upside, necessitating more often, we think in the future, tamping down such pressures. We don't think of runaway inflation at all, but sort of an upside pressure on the price side. And that makes it much more difficult to have these somewhat indulgent and sometimes frivolous tactical stimulus ploys that have historically pushed the economy.
Would you like to be a part of the conversations at the Economic Club of New York? Learn more about membership, the New York City and National Fellows programs, and other opportunities for engagement in the club at www.econclubny.org.
In the book, you describe kind of good macro and really describing that we've been in a good macro environment for 40 years. I'd like, if you can, kind of describe what you mean by good macro, and would you have been able, had you had this approach in 2007, to identify 2008 coming in?
So first off, good macro is a term of art that we use to describe almost the mindset that a lot of investors and executives currently, that's how they grew up. This is the last 30, 40 years where, inflation was structurally anchored, still think it is and still think it will be. But you had a confluence of drivers in the financial economy that were benign. In the real economy, recessions became less frequent, cycles became longer. The global economy converged on a model that was essentially a liberal market economy model, and you saw more assimilation and the proliferation of value chains, institutions that underpinned all this. And so anyone under the age of 55, 60 today essentially grew up with that, post-Cold War window of what we call good macro. There were setbacks, there were hiccups like 2008, no doubt. But even then, policymakers stepped in, existential stimulus again that we discussed earlier, and they delivered the longest expansion on record after 2008. So clearly there was this worked, and for that reason, macro wasn't always sort of top of mind for executives in boardrooms. It wasn't always top of mind for investors, and macro has gained a lot more significance now that there's so much volatility in all of these dimensions that I just mentioned. So on the inflation side, and there's physical economy disruptions we hadn't before. And obviously in the global dimension, we see a lot of gyrations and volatility also. So essentially what we argue in the book, this good macro regime is changing, but we don't think it's over or done with. There's still a lot of very good underpinnings that will allow firms to be profitable, investors to make money. That change is significant and requires a much greater attention to be paid to what's happening. But we don't like this reading that because of this succession of shocks and crises we had, that now good macro has flipped into bad macro. We don't see it that way. On the contrary, we make a pitch that in the book that the 2020s to us looks like an era of tightness that delivers strong growth and certain pressure cooker type economic environments. I think that was the good macro part. You also mentioned 2008 and whether that was forecastable. At the time, also, I didn't really publish in that sense. There will always be surprises. There will be exogenous shocks. There will be endogenous shocks that you don't see. A lot of them are very hard to spot, particularly in the financial system. The financial system is opaque. It is complex. SVB was a reminder that this can come out of nowhere and rise to the top of the agenda, and rightly so. It was also a reminder that stimulus and policymakers are powerful. They did de-risk SVB quite successfully. There's sort of knock-on effects. We've had a few other hiccups in that regard, and there may be others. We can also discuss commercial real estate, which, however, I think is contained as a risk. It's just a reminder that, yes, there will be another hiccup in the financial system. There will be another failure. There will be another thing. Could it be something that is truly ugly and systemically relevant? Yeah, absolutely. But it's also so hard to see that with any degree of confidence and transparency to make the case, this is the next thing that's going to happen. I'm going to go out there and warn you about it. Then we're just sort of inches away from the doomsaying narrative. To pick one of those, I couldn't do that with a good conscience, and therefore I don't do it.
You talk in the book about geopolitical risks. Obviously, there are more facing us today than usual. Is that likely to be one of the crises that you foresee, or how do you think about geopolitical risk generally?
In the book, we cast geopolitical risk as systemically, routinely overstated. Not because it can't do damage, it can, but the bar is quite high. And we remind people that everyone's a bit of a hobby geopolitical analyst, and often we have this assumption that crises in the geopolitical space feed through to the economy, like cleanly. But actually they don't. And we have lots of historical evidence for this, but also just in the present day. I mean, think about Ukraine, which is a true tragedy and a humanitarian disaster and a reshuffling of the geopolitical landscape, particularly for Europe. But it did not deliver a recession in the Eurozone, despite everything. The spiking energy prices did not trigger that meltdown that was almost universally predicted at the time. And similarly, you could argue that with the onset of the Hamas war and the attacks initially on Israel, oil prices have not signaled an unraveling of global economic conditions. On the contrary, oil prices have been lower every single day since the start of this conflict than they were before its start. And so there's several chapters in the book that try to recalibrate how we view geopolitical risk. It's very tempting to ascribe a lot to it. In reality, I think we need to be very careful and ask very hard questions. What are the transmission channels from geopolitics to the US economy or another big economy that generally will give you a drawdown and maybe a recession? The bar is higher than you might think, is the argument in the book.
You've been listening to The Forum by the Economic Club of New York, a nonprofit 501c3 dedicated to connecting the world's brightest minds for critical, nonpartisan conversations. Be sure to subscribe now to be alerted to future new episodes. Would you like to be a part of the conversation at the Economic Club of New York? Learn more about membership, the New York City and National Fellows programs, and other opportunities for engagement in the club at www.econclubny.org. I'm your host, Becky Quick. Thanks for listening.